Sometimes the dreams we hold closest are the ones life takes away without warning. Jonas Macready learned that truth on a cold autumn morning in 1887, when a doctor told him he'd never father the family he'd spent 15 years dreaming about. He was a mountain man in the Colorado Territory, strong, capable, and suddenly feeling like half a man. Jonas figured he'd spend the rest of his days alone in his cabin, and he'd made peace with that. Then Eleanor Hartwell, the town's school teacher, showed up with 9 wild horses and a strange proposition. She needed help with these animals, and she wouldn't take no for an answer. What neither of them knew was that sometimes broken people and broken horses find their way to exactly where they belong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. Jonas Macready had built his cabin with his own 2 hands 15 years ago, when he was 25 and the world still felt full of possibility. The structure sat in a small clearing halfway up the mountain, surrounded by ponderosa pines that whispered secrets in the wind. He'd chosen this spot carefully, close enough to town for trading, far enough for the solitude a trapper needed. Back then, he'd imagined adding rooms as children came along. He'd pictured a woman hanging laundry on a line he'd string between 2 aspens. He'd seen it all so clearly. The cabin remained a single room. Every morning, Jonas rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and set coffee to boil in the battered pot that had crossed the plains with him from Missouri. He'd pull on his boots, worn soft from years of mountain trails, and step out into air so cold it burned his lungs clean. This was his rhythm, his life, checking trap lines in winter, hunting in fall, trading furs and venison in town when he needed supplies. He was good at it, known for it. Fair, honest, never cheated a man in his life. The town of Ridgway lay 8 miles down the mountain, a collection of weathered buildings that serviced the ranchers, miners, and scattered homesteaders of this corner of Colorado Territory. Jonas made the trip once a week, sometimes less in deep winter. He'd sell his furs at the trading post, buy flour and coffee and tobacco at the general store, exchange brief words with men who respected him but didn't really know him. That was fine. He'd never been much for talking. Martha Brennan, who ran the general store with her husband Frank, was the closest thing Jonas had to a friend in town. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, quick to laugh and quicker to spot trouble. She'd known Jonas since he first arrived, had watched him build his reputation as a man of his word. Sometimes she'd pack extra biscuits in his supplies, wave off his protests. "You're too thin," she'd say. "A man needs more than coffee and venison." What Martha didn't know, what nobody knew except Jonas and the traveling doctor who'd passed through 3 weeks ago, was that Jonas's careful plans had crumbled to dust on a Tuesday morning in late September. The doctor had been making rounds, offering examinations for $1. Jonas had gone mostly because he'd been feeling tired, figured maybe he needed a tonic or some advice on diet. The man had been thorough, asked questions Jonas found strange and invasive. Then came the examination, the thoughtful silence, the careful words that shattered everything. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but you'll never father children. The condition is permanent, something you were likely born with. There's nothing to be done." Jonas had paid the $1, walked out into brilliant sunshine that seemed like an insult, and rode home in a fog. He'd sat on his porch for hours, watching shadows lengthen across the clearing, feeling something fundamental break inside his chest. The cradle was in the barn, hidden under a canvas tarp. He'd started carving it 7 years ago, working on it in winter evenings when the snow piled high and the nights stretched long. Cherry wood, smooth as silk under his hands. He'd shaped the rockers with patience, carved a simple pattern of pine branches along the headboard. It wasn't finished. He'd been waiting, wanting to complete it for a real child, not just a dream. Now it sat there like an accusation, like evidence of his failure. Jonas hadn't told anyone. What would he say? How do you explain that the future you'd been building in your head, piece by careful piece, was never going to happen? That every choice you'd made, the cabin, the clearing, the life of hard work and careful saving, was pointed towards something impossible. He'd stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary. Stopped making small talk with Martha. Stopped looking at families when he did venture down the mountain. Children playing in the street felt like knives in his chest. Young couples walking arm in arm made him want to break things. 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks of waking up to emptiness that felt heavier each day. He told himself he was being foolish. Plenty of men lived alone, died alone, left nothing behind but a piece of land and some tools. That was honest work, an honest life. His father back in Missouri had built a legacy. 6 children, a farm that would pass down through generations. His father had given Jonas the pocket watch before he left, engraved with words that now felt cruel. To build a legacy. Jonas had carried that watch west with pride, certain he'd honor those words, certain he'd create something lasting. Now the watch sat on his mantle, and he couldn't look at it without feeling shame. The first snow had dusted the peaks last week, reminder that winter was coming. Jonas had work to do, traps to set, meat to smoke, wood to split. He threw himself into the labor, welcomed the exhaustion that let him sleep without dreaming. He'd made his peace with it, or so he told himself. This was his lot. A man didn't get to choose his fate, only how he faced it. He figured he'd spend the rest of his days up here, alone but self-sufficient. He'd die eventually, and someone would find the cabin and maybe wonder briefly about the man who'd lived here. That would be the end of it. No legacy, no family, no continuation. Just a life, lived and finished, like smoke dissipating in mountain air. Jonas had accepted it. He'd accepted it completely. Then Eleanor Hartwell rode up his trail on a cool October morning, leading 9 horses and carrying a proposition that made no sense at all. He'd seen her around town, of course. Hard to miss the school teacher. She was a handsome woman, maybe 35, with dark hair she wore in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to notice everything. Widowed 5 years back, Martha had mentioned once. Her husband had died in a logging accident up north. She'd come to Ridgeway afterwards, taken the teaching position, kept mostly to herself. Respectable. Quiet. Not the kind of woman who rode alone up to a bachelor's cabin with a herd of horses and an expression that suggested she wouldn't take no for an answer. But that's exactly what she did. Jonas had been splitting wood when he heard the horses. He'd straightened, axe in hand, and watched her approach. 9 mares of various sizes and colors, all of them moving skittish, ears back, eyes rolling white. Eleanor sat her own horse like she'd been born in the saddle, calm and steady, despite the nervous energy of the animals she led. She'd reined up 20 feet from his porch, studying him with those observant eyes. "Mr. Macready," she'd said, "I need your help with these horses." Just like that. No preamble, no apology for the intrusion, direct as a surveyor's line. Jonas had set down the axe, wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool air. "Ma'am, I've purchased these animals," Eleanor continued. "They were being mistreated. I couldn't let them go to slaughter, and I couldn't leave them where they were. But they won't let anyone near them, and I don't have land suitable for keeping them." "That's unfortunate," Jonas had said, already seeing where this was headed, and wanting no part of it. "I'm told you're skilled with animals. Patient. and you have land here." She gestured to his clearing, the meadow beyond. "I'm proposing a partnership. You provide the space and expertise. I'll pay for all feed and supplies. These horses need time and gentleness. I believe you can provide both." Jonas had felt irritation rise in his chest. "I'm not taking on anyone else's problems, Mum. I've got my own work to do." Eleanor had studied him for a long moment, and he'd had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing more than he wanted to show. "I'm not asking you to fix them, Mr. Macready," she'd said quietly. "I'm asking you to give them a chance to heal. There's a difference." Something about those words had struck him like a physical blow. Give them a chance to heal. As if healing was even possible for creatures that had been broken badly enough. He'd wanted to say no. Wanted to send her back down the mountain with her traumatized horses and her impossible requests. But she'd sat there on her horse, waiting, and the silence had stretched between them until he'd heard himself say, "I'll think about it." "I'll come back tomorrow morning," Eleanor had replied, as if his thinking about it was the same as agreeing. "Early. We'll need most of the day to get them settled properly." Then she'd turned her horse and headed back down the trail, the 9 mares following in a nervous, skittish line. Jonas had stood in his yard, watching until they disappeared into the trees, wondering what in God's name had just happened. That night, he'd gone to the barn and pulled back the tarp covering the cradle. He'd run his hands over the smooth cherry wood, feeling the grooves where he'd carved each detail with care. All this work, all this hope, for nothing. Just like these horses, broken things that couldn't be fixed, couldn't serve the purpose they were meant for. He should have said no outright, should have sent her away the moment she proposed this foolish plan. But something in her voice, when she'd said, "Give them a chance to heal," had lodged in his chest like a splinter. Something about the way she'd looked at him, like she'd known exactly what kind of broken thing she was talking to. Jonas had covered the cradle again, walked back to the cabin, and lain awake most of the night. When dawn came, he'd made fresh coffee and waited. Sure enough, just after sunrise, he heard horses on the trail. Eleanor Hartwell was coming back, and Jonas realized with something between resignation and curiosity that he was going to say yes. He didn't know why. Didn't know what he hoped to accomplish with 9 traumatized horses and a determined schoolteacher who seemed to see right through his walls. But he was going to say yes. Maybe broken things deserved a chance, after all. Eleanor arrived with a wagon full of supplies and a determination that seemed to fill the entire clearing. Jonas watched from his porch as she navigated the rutted trail, the same 9 horses trailing behind on long lead ropes, still skittish, still wild-eyed with fear. "Good morning, Mr. Macready," she called out, setting the wagon brake with practiced efficiency. "I brought hay, oats, and some medical supplies. I wasn't sure what condition your fencing was in, so I also brought wire and posts if we need them." Jonas descended the porch steps slowly, taking in the organized chaos of her preparation. She'd thought of everything, which somehow made him feel both impressed and irritated. This woman had assumed his cooperation before he'd even given it. "Ma'am, I haven't actually said I'd do this," he pointed out. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, brushing dust from her split riding skirt. She wore practical clothes, he noticed. Nothing fancy, everything chosen for function. A woman who understood work. "You're still here," she said simply. "You could have left before dawn, avoided me entirely. The fact that you're standing on your porch with fresh coffee made tells me you've already decided." She was right, and that irritated him more. Jonas gestured toward the horses, who were huddled together at the far end of their lead ropes, as far from the humans as they could manage. "Tell me about them," he said. "The truth. What happened to these animals?" Eleanor's expression shifted, something hard and angry flashing across her features before she controlled it. She reached into the satchel she carried, pulled out a worn leather bag, and handed it to Jonas. Inside was a rope halter, stiff with dried blood. "Ranch hand named Dalton purchased them at auction 6 months ago," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "Promised the sellers he was building a breeding program. What he actually did was try to break them using methods that would make you sick. Starvation, beatings, restraints that cut into their flesh. 2 of them still have scars you'll see once we can get close enough." Jonas examined the halter, jaw clenched. He'd seen cruelty before. The mountains attracted all kinds, and not all of them good. But there was something particularly vile about a man who'd take animals meant to be magnificent and reduce them to trembling, terrified creatures. "How'd you get them away from him?" he asked. "I heard about the situation from one of my students. Her father works at the ranch. When I confronted Dalton, he laughed, said they were worthless anyway, couldn't be ridden or bred in their condition. I offered him what he'd paid at auction, plus $20. He took it." Eleanor's hands had curled into fists. "I used the money my husband had saved. We were going to buy land, raise horses together. He died before we could." Jonas looked up sharply. This wasn't just about rescuing animals. This was about finishing something left undone, about honoring a dead man's dream. "So this is personal," he said quietly. "Everything worth doing is personal, Mr. Macready." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their respective griefs hanging between them like morning mist. Jonas set down the bloody halter, looked at the horses, really looked at them. 9 mares, ranging from a young filly barely 2 years old to an older grey who might have been 15. Different colours, bays and chestnuts, one paint, one palomino. The grey, each one carrying trauma in her eyes. "They'll need space," he said, his voice rough. "Can't crowd them, can't rush them. Might take months before they trust enough to touch." "I have time," Eleanor replied. "I teach Monday through Friday, but I can be here every evening and all day, Saturday and Sunday. Town's going to talk. You coming up here that often?" "Let them talk." Jonas studied her face, saw the steel beneath the proper schoolteacher exterior. This was a woman who'd made up her mind. Consequences be damned. He recognized that determination because he'd felt it himself once, before the doctor's words had drained all purpose from his bones. "All right," he heard himself say. "We'll try. But I'm telling you now, some of these horses might never fully recover. Some trauma runs too deep." Eleanor met his eyes, and for a moment he felt like she wasn't talking about horses at all when she said, "Some trauma runs deep. But that doesn't mean healing is impossible. Just means it takes longer, requires more patience." They spent the next several hours setting up a temporary corral, using Jonas's existing fence line and the additional posts Eleanor had brought. She worked alongside him without complaint, digging post holes, stringing wire, her hands developing blisters she didn't mention. Jonas found himself grudgingly impressed. Most women of his acquaintance, not that he had many, would have supervised from a distance. Eleanor got her hands dirty. When the corral was ready, they faced the challenge of moving the horses into it. Jonas approached slowly, hands visible, voice low and steady. The horses immediately panicked, bolting to the end of their ropes, eyes rolling white, several of them rearing. One mare, a young bay, pulled so hard she flipped herself backwards, landing with a thud that made Eleanor gasp. Jonas froze, waiting. The bay struggled to her feet, uninjured but terrified. The message was clear. These animals expected pain from human contact. Every instinct they had screamed danger. "We're going to need a different approach," Jonas said quietly. "Eleanor, step back to the wagon. Let me try alone." Eleanor hesitated, then complied. Jonas waited until she was 30 feet away, then slowly, carefully, began unhitching the lead ropes from the wagon. Instead of pulling or guiding, he simply dropped each rope on the ground and stepped away. The horses, feeling the sudden freedom, didn't bolt. They stood confused, uncertain. Jonas backed up until he was at the open corral gate, then sat down in the dirt. He sat there for an hour, not moving, barely breathing. Eleanor watched from the wagon, silent and still. The sun climbed higher. A hawk circled overhead. The horses gradually stopped trembling, started grazing on the sparse grass near the wagon. One of them, the older grey mare, lifted her head and looked at Jonas. Really looked, not just a panicked glance, but an assessment. Her ears swiveled forward slightly. Jonas didn't react, didn't move, just sat. The grey mare took one step toward him. Then another. She stopped 20 feet away, head high, ready to flee. But she was curious now, not just terrified. Jonas spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's all right, girl. You take your time. Nobody's going to hurt you here." The mare's ears flicked at the sound. She didn't run. Slowly, moving like he was underwater, Jonas stood and walked backward into the corral. He left the gate wide open. Then he sat down again, this time inside the fence. Another hour passed. The sun was well past noon when the grey mare, still trailing her lead rope, walked cautiously through the open gate. She didn't approach Jonas, just entered the space and stood there, tense, but holding her ground. One by one, over the next 2 hours, the other horses followed. They were herd animals, and where the grey led, they eventually came. By mid-afternoon, all 9 horses were inside the corral. Jonas stood carefully, walked to the gate, and closed it. He turned to find Eleanor standing nearby, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, concerned. "Nothing's wrong," she said, wiping her eyes. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. 4 men tried to move those horses last week. It took them 6 hours, and 3 of the horses injured themselves trying to escape. You did it in 3 hours without touching them once." Jonas felt heat rise in his face, uncomfortable with the praise. "They're smart animals. Just needed to be given a choice, instead of being forced." "Not just smart," Eleanor said. "Survivors. Like recognizers, I think." There was that feeling again, like she was seeing through him to something he didn't want exposed. Jonas turned away, focused on the horses. They were clustered together at the far end of the corral, still wary, but no longer in full panic. "That grey mare," he said. "She's the leader. We win her trust. The others will follow." "What should we call her?" Eleanor asked. Jonas studied the mare's intelligent eyes, the way she positioned herself between him and the younger horses. Protective, cautious, wise. "Sage," he said. "We'll call her Sage." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look younger, less burdened. "Sage. I like that." They stood together, watching the horses settle. The young bay who'd fallen was grazing now. The immediate terror faded. The paint mare was drinking from the water trough Jonas had filled earlier. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. "I should head back to town before dark," Eleanor said eventually. "But I'll return tomorrow after school, around 4 o'clock, if that suits you." "I'll be here." Eleanor gathered her satchel, prepared to climb back into the wagon. Then she paused, turned back to him. Mr. Macready, may I ask you something personal? Jonas tensed. Depends on the question. Why did you say yes to this? You clearly didn't want the trouble, and you don't know me from Eve. Why help? Jonas looked at the horses, at Sage watching him with those careful, assessing eyes. Why had he said yes? Because Eleanor had asked? Because the horses needed help? Or because somewhere in the wreckage of his shattered plans, he needed to believe that broken things could be made whole again? Maybe I needed the distraction, he said finally, which was true, but not the whole truth. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. I don't think that's it. But I won't push. Thank you, Mr. Macready, for giving them a chance. She climbed into the wagon and headed down the trail. Jonas watched until she disappeared into the trees, then turned back to the corral. Sage was still watching him. In the fading afternoon light, her grey coat looked silver, almost luminous. She was beautiful in the way wild things are beautiful. Powerful, free, unbroken despite everything she'd endured. Jonas thought about the cradle in the barn, about the pocket watch on his mantle, about 15 years of careful planning that had led to nothing. Then he thought about Eleanor's words. Some trauma runs deep, but that doesn't mean healing is impossible. He pulled up a stump, positioned it near the corral fence, and sat down. The horses shifted nervously, but Sage didn't bolt. She just watched, ears forward, waiting to see what this strange man would do next. Jonas sat there until sunset painted the mountains purple and gold. He sat until the stars came out. He sat until his body ached, and the cold made him stiff. And Sage watched him the whole time, learning that sometimes humans could be still and quiet and patient. Learning, perhaps, that not all hands brought pain. When Jonas finally stood and walked to the cabin, leaving the horses to their first night of safety, he felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, exactly. That felt too dangerous. But maybe the smallest crack in the wall of resignation he'd built around his heart. Maybe Eleanor was right. Maybe healing wasn't impossible, just difficult and slow and requiring more patience than most people possessed. Jonas had nothing but time and patience now. His original plans were ashes. But here were 9 horses who needed exactly what he could offer. It wasn't what he'd wanted. It wasn't the legacy his father had envisioned. But it was something. And something, Jonas was beginning to think, might be enough. Inside the cabin, Eleanor looked around with undisguised curiosity. Jonas saw his home through her eyes, Spartan, functional, with none of the touches that marked it as truly lived in. No curtains, no pictures, no softness anywhere. Just tools, supplies, and the necessities of survival. It's very practical, Eleanor said diplomatically. It's empty, Jonas replied, surprising himself with the honesty. I kept it this way deliberately. Didn't seem right to make it comfortable for just me when I was planning on it being temporary. 15 years is a long temporary. Jonas busied himself making coffee, grateful for something to do with his hands. I kept thinking next year I'd meet someone. Next year I'd start building the additions. Next year the real life would begin. Then the years just kept passing and I kept waiting. Eleanor settled into the chair by the fire, accepting the coffee he handed her. We're alike in that way. I've been living in temporary for 5 years now. The house I rent in town, the way I keep my belongings, it's all temporary, waiting for a permanent that I know isn't coming. They drank in silence for a while, listening to the wind pick up outside. The storm was intensifying. Jonas glanced out the window and frowned. You might be here a while. This is shaping up to be a real blow. I should try to make it back before dark, Eleanor said. though she didn't sound convinced. In this, you'd freeze or lose the trail. Both, most likely. Jonas tried to keep his voice matter-of-fact. You can stay here. I'll sleep in the barn with the horses, keep an eye on them through the night. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. That's not necessary. I trust you, Jonas. And besides, you'll freeze in the barn. We're both adults. I'll sleep by the fire, you take the loft. We'll be perfectly proper. The suggestion sent a spike of panic through him, not because he didn't trust himself, but because he trusted his feelings too much. Having Eleanor in his space, overnight, felt dangerously intimate, but the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and he knew she was right. Attempting the trail now would be foolish. All right, he agreed, but I'll make up a proper bed by the fire. You'll be more comfortable. As the short winter day faded into darkness, they settled into an unexpected domesticity. Eleanor had bread and cheese in her basket, which they shared for dinner. Jonas added some dried venison and the last of his preserved apples. It was the best meal he'd had in months, not because of the food itself, but because of the company. Tell me about your family, Eleanor said. Your father, the pocket watch. There's a story there. Jonas retrieved the watch from the mantel, turned it over in his hands. The engraving caught the firelight. To build a legacy. My father was a good man. Stern, had high expectations, but fair. He built a farm from nothing in Missouri, raised 6 children, saw them all settled. I'm the youngest. By the time I was old enough to help with the farm, my brothers had it well in hand. Father told me I should go west, build something of my own, create a legacy the way he had. Jonas's thumb traced the engraving. He gave me this the day I left. I've carried it every day since, reminder of what I was supposed to accomplish. And you feel you failed him. Haven't I? He wanted grandchildren, wanted the Macready name to continue through me. Instead, I'm alone on a mountain, helping heal horses that aren't even mine. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression intense. Jonas, listen to me. Legacy isn't just blood. It's not just children carrying on your name. It's the mark you leave on the world, the good you do, the lives you touch. Those horses out there, you're giving them a second chance. That matters. That's legacy. It's not what he meant, Jonas said stubbornly. Maybe not. But it's what you have to offer. And it's enough. Eleanor reached out, touched his hand briefly. My husband used to say that the life we plan and the life we get are rarely the same. The measure of a person is what they do with the life they actually have, not the one they imagined. Jonas looked at their hands, hers still resting on his, small and capable and warm. He should pull away, should maintain the proper distance. Instead, he found himself turning his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. I'm beginning to think, he said slowly, that maybe you showing up with those horses wasn't random chance. I don't believe in random chance, Eleanor replied. I believe in paths crossing when they're meant to. I needed help with the horses. You needed a reason to keep going. Maybe we were always meant to find each other. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, Jonas felt something warm and dangerous growing. He was falling for this woman, had been falling since she first rode up his trail with her impossible request and her refusal to take no for an answer. The realization should have terrified him. In some ways it did. But it also felt inevitable, like watching spring arrive after a brutal winter. Eleanor, he said, there are things you should know about me. I'm not easy to live with. I'm used to solitude, used to silence. I don't have much to offer except this mountain and hard work. I don't need easy, Eleanor said, and I'm used to solitude myself. As for not having much to offer, Jonas, you're one of the most genuine people I've ever met. You care about doing things right. You have patience and gentleness and integrity. That's more than most people have to give. But I can't give you children, can't give you the family your husband wanted for you. Eleanor's eyes glistened in the firelight. Thomas wanted me to be happy. He wanted me to live fully, not just survive. You make me feel alive again, Jonas. You make me want to build something new instead of just mourning what I lost. That's what he would have wanted. They sat together as the fire burned low, hands still entwined, neither quite ready to break the connection. Outside, the storm buried the mountain in snow. Inside, two broken people were discovering that their shattered pieces might fit together in unexpected ways. Finally, reluctantly, Eleanor withdrew her hand. I should let you sleep. Morning will come early, and the horses will need tending regardless of the weather. Jonas built up the fire, arranged blankets for her, then climbed to the loft. He lay in the darkness, listening to Eleanor's breathing, acutely aware of her presence below. Sleep was a long time coming. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed not of the family he'd never have, but of the life that might be possible with this remarkable woman who'd appeared when he needed her most. The storm blew itself out by morning. They worked together in comfortable silence, digging out the horses, checking for frostbite and injury. All 9 animals had weathered the storm well, protected by the shelter Jonas and Eleanor had built together. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Sage did something remarkable. She approached Jonas directly, close enough that he could have touched her. She didn't flinch, didn't flee. Just stood there, accepting his presence. Eleanor watched with tears in her eyes. She's healing, she whispered. Jonas looked at Eleanor, then at Sage, then back at Eleanor. We all are, he said, even when we don't expect to. December settled over the mountain with a cold that seemed to seep into bones and stay there. Jonas and Eleanor's partnership had shifted into something neither of them named, but both felt. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. The silences between them became comfortable, filled with understanding rather than awkwardness. Eleanor still wore her wedding ring on a chain around her neck, but Jonas noticed she touched it less frequently now. She told him about Thomas with fondness rather than sharp grief, speaking of her late husband the way one speaks of a cherished memory rather than an open wound. I've been thinking about taking the ring off, she said one afternoon, as they worked on repairing fence damaged by the latest storm. Not forgetting Thomas, but acknowledging that I'm ready to move forward. Jonas paused in his work, hammer in hand. That's a big step. 5 years is long enough to mourn. Thomas would have wanted me to live, not just exist as a memorial to him. Eleanor looked at Jonas directly. He would have liked you, I think. You're similar in some ways. Quiet, steady, patient with things that need time. I'm honored you think so. Eleanor smiled. Don't be too honored. He was also stubborn, occasionally frustrating, and had a tendency to bottle up his feelings until they exploded. Despite himself, Jonas laughed. Are you saying I'm stubborn and frustrating? I'm saying you're human. We both are. Flawed, carrying baggage, trying our best to move forward despite our scars. She hammered a nail with more force than necessary. The question is whether we're brave enough to try together. The words hung between them, an invitation and a challenge. Jonas set down his hammer, wiped his hands on his pants, and walked over to where Eleanor stood. She looked up at him, her expression open and vulnerable in a way that made his chest tight. I want to try, he said quietly, "but I'm scared. What if I can't be what you need? What if this doesn't work? Then we'll have tried and failed together, which is better than never trying at all." Eleanor reached up, touched his face gently. "I'm scared too, Jonas. But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to reach for it." Jonas covered her hand with his, holding it against his cheek. They stood that way for a long moment, the cold air around them, the horses watching with curious eyes. Then, slowly, carefully, Jonas leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, the kiss of two people learning each other for the first time. Eleanor's lips were soft, tasting of coffee and hope. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard, visible puffs of white in the cold air. "Well," Eleanor said, her voice shaky, "that was worth the wait." Jonas laughed, a real laugh that felt like it came from somewhere deep inside he'd forgotten existed. "I should have done that weeks ago. You did it when you were ready. That's what matters." They went back to work, but everything felt different now. A line had been crossed, an acknowledgement made. They were courting, though neither said the word. They were building toward something, though the shape of it remained unclear. The horses continued to heel. 6 of them now approached readily. A loud touch even seemed to enjoy human company. Copper followed Eleanor everywhere she went, his attachment obvious and endearing. Willow had become gentle enough to halter and lead. Sage, the wise grey mare, accepted Jonas completely, would eat from his hand, stand calmly while he checked her hooves, even rest her head against his shoulder in what felt like trust and affection. But 2 horses remained broken, the bay with the limp, whom they'd named Grace, and the small sorrel, called Hope. These 2 stayed at the back of the herd, flinching at sudden movements, unable to accept kindness. Their fear ran so deep it seemed permanent. "What if they never heal?" Eleanor asked one evening, watching Hope tremble at Jonas's approach from 30 feet away. "Then we keep them safe and comfortable anyway," Jonas replied. "Healing isn't always complete. Sometimes it's just learning to live with the damage." Eleanor looked at him thoughtfully. "Is that what you're doing? Learning to live with the damage?" "I'm trying to, with your help." The town had begun to notice their courtship. Martha at the general store gave Jonas knowing smiles when he came in for supplies. The pastor had mentioned to Eleanor that he'd be happy to perform a wedding ceremony whenever she was ready. The gossip was mostly kind, though Jonas had overheard a few men at the trading post expressing doubt that a proper school teacher should be spending so much time alone with a bachelor. "Let them talk," Eleanor had said when Jonas mentioned it. "I stopped living for other people's approval when Thomas died. Life's too short and too uncertain to waste it on propriety." Still, Jonas worried about her reputation. He worried that their unconventional courtship might affect her position at the school, might make life difficult for her in town. "Marry me," he said one afternoon, the words coming out abrupt and unplanned. Eleanor looked up from the horse she was grooming, startled. "What?" "Marry me," Jonas repeated, his heart pounding. "Make it official. Proper. I don't want people talking about you, questioning your character. And I don't want to spend another day pretending I'm not completely in love with you." Eleanor set down her brush, walked over to stand in front of him. "Jonas Macready, that is possibly the worst proposal I've ever heard. You're doing it to protect my reputation." "I'm doing it because I want to wake up every morning with you beside me," Jonas said, finding his words now. "I'm doing it because you've given me a reason to hope again, to believe my life isn't over just because it didn't go according to plan." I'm doing it because I love you, Eleanor, and I want to build whatever kind of legacy we can create together." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She touched the chain around her neck where her wedding ring rested. Then slowly, deliberately, she removed it. She held the ring in her palm for a moment, then tucked it carefully into her pocket. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." They set the wedding for early spring, giving the winter time to pass and the trails to clear. Eleanor continued teaching, Jonas continued working his trap lines, and together they cared for the horses through the long Colorado winter. The plan was simple, practical, built on mutual respect and growing love. Then, on a grey morning in late January, Eleanor arrived with something in her hand that changed everything. Jonas saw immediately that something was different. Eleanor's face was flushed, her eyes bright with an emotion he couldn't quite read. She dismounted quickly, almost stumbling in her haste. "What's wrong?" Jonas asked, alarmed. "Nothing's wrong. At least I don't think so." Eleanor pulled an envelope from her coat. "I found this last night. It was in a box of Thomas's things I'd been avoiding going through. I think I was meant to find it now, after all this time." She handed him the envelope. It was addressed to Eleanor in a masculine hand, the paper yellowed with age. Jonas looked at her questioningly. "Thomas wrote it before he died. Not the day before, months before. He knew the logging work was dangerous, that any day could be his last. He left instructions for me, things he wanted me to know if something happened to him." Eleanor's voice shook slightly. "I need you to read it, Jonas. I need you to understand." Jonas opened the envelope carefully, unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the words of a man who'd thought carefully about what he wanted to say. "My dearest Eleanor," Jonas read aloud. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing a future without me. I'm sorry for that, sorrier than words can express. But I need you to know some things. Need you to hear them even if I'm not there to say them in person. First, don't mourn me too long. You have so much life left to live, so much love left to give. I want you to find someone else, Eleanor. I want you to be happy, to build the life we dreamed of, even if I'm not there to build it with you. I know you wanted children, and I know we couldn't have them. That wasn't your fault, no matter what the doctors said or what you believed in your darkest moments. You are whole and worthy, and enough exactly as you are. If you find love again, find someone who understands that. Find someone who values you for you, not for what you can or cannot give them. Second, about the horses. You know I always dreamed of raising them, of having land where we could give broken animals a second chance. If I don't make it, I want you to do that anyway. Use the money I've saved. It's in the bank in Denver. The account information is with our papers. Buy horses that need help. Find someone patient and kind to help you care for them. Find someone who understands that healing takes time, that some wounds don't show but run deep nonetheless. I have a very specific picture in my mind of the kind of person I hope you'll find. Someone patient, with gentle hands, someone who knows how to be still, how to wait, how to let healing happen at its own pace. Someone who's been hurt themselves and knows that trauma doesn't make a creature worthless, just more in need of understanding. I'm describing someone who can heal horses, Eleanor, but I'm also describing someone who can heal you, who can let you heal them in return. When you find this person, and I believe you will, don't hesitate. Don't let fear or grief or misplaced loyalty to my memory stop you from reaching for happiness. I'm giving you permission, Eleanor. I'm asking you, as my last request, to live fully and love completely. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. The years we had together were the finest of my life. But they were just the beginning of your story, not the end. Write the rest of it beautifully, my darling. Write it with joy and courage and hope. All my love, always, Thomas. Jonas finished reading and stood in silence, the letter trembling in his hands. He looked at Eleanor, saw tears streaming down her face, saw something else too, a kind of peace, a settling of something long unsettled. He described you, Eleanor said softly. Months before I even knew you existed, Thomas described exactly who you are. Patient, gentle hands, someone who knows how to wait, someone who's been hurt and understands healing. He was describing you, Jonas. Jonas felt his throat tighten. Eleanor, I don't know what to... I need you to understand something, Eleanor interrupted. When I came to you with those horses, I wasn't being entirely honest about my reasons. I'd heard about you, yes. Observed you, yes. But it was more than that. I'd read this letter 6 months before I found those horses. I'd known what Thomas wanted, known he was giving me permission to move forward. And when I saw those 9 horses suffering, when I knew they needed exactly the kind of person Thomas had described, I thought of you. Jonas felt something cold settle in his stomach. So this was planned. You came to me with a plan, not just a request for help. Not planned, exactly. More like I recognized an opportunity when it presented itself. Eleanor stepped closer. Those horses genuinely needed help, Jonas. That part was real. But I'd also been working up the courage for months to approach you, to see if you might be the person Thomas hoped I'd find. The horses gave me an excuse. An excuse. Jonas heard the flatness in his own voice. A reason that wasn't terrifying, Eleanor corrected. I couldn't just ride up here and say, my late husband told me to find love again, and I think you might be that person. But I could ask for help with horses. I could start a partnership that might become something more if we both wanted it to. Jonas turned away, his mind reeling. The past months replayed in a different light. Every moment, every conversation, every step toward intimacy. Had it all been orchestrated? Had Eleanor been following some script her dead husband had written? Jonas, please, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. I know this sounds calculated, but it wasn't like that. Yes, I came to you with hope that something might develop. But everything after that first day was real. The way I feel about you is real. The love I have for you is real. Thomas gave me permission to look for happiness, but he didn't create the happiness itself. You did that. We did that together. You should have told me, Jonas said, still not turning around. Before I fell in love with you, before I proposed, you should have told me the truth. I know, I should have. I was scared you'd think exactly what you're thinking now, that I was using you, manipulating you, following some blueprint instead of genuinely caring for you. Jonas thought about the past months, thought about Eleanor's patience with the horses, her willingness to work in the cold, her genuine joy at every small victory, thought about the night of the storm, the conversations, the gradual opening of both their hearts. Had that been manipulation, or had it been 2 broken people genuinely finding each other? He turned to face her. Tell me the truth, Eleanor, all of it. Do you love me for myself, or because I fit the description in that letter? Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. I love you because you're kind and patient and genuine. I love you because you make me laugh, because you listen when I talk, because you understand grief without trying to fix it. I love you because when I'm with you, I feel whole instead of broken. Thomas's letter gave me permission to look for love again. And yes, it gave me an idea of what kind of person might be right for me. But you became real to me, Jonas. Not a description in a letter, but a flesh and blood man I fell in love with despite my fear, not because of a dead man's instructions. Jonas looked at the letter still in his hands, read Thomas's words again. Someone who's been hurt themselves and knows that trauma doesn't make a creature worthless, just more in need of understanding. Thomas had understood something fundamental about healing, about partnership, about what Eleanor would need. He wanted you to be happy, Jonas said slowly. That's what this letter is really about. Not giving you a blueprint, but giving you permission to move forward. Yes, Eleanor whispered. And the horses, the timing. You saw an opportunity to test whether I might be the kind of person he described. I saw an opportunity to approach you without terrifying myself with vulnerability. The horses needed help regardless. If nothing had developed between us, they still would have been saved. Jonas considered this. Was he angry? Yes, somewhat. She should have been honest earlier. But was he angry enough to walk away from what they'd built? He thought about the past months, about the genuine connection he'd felt, about the way Eleanor had shared her own pain and vulnerability. "Show me the ring," he said finally. Eleanor looked confused but reached into her pocket, pulled out the gold band she'd worn for years. She placed it in his palm. Jonas examined it, saw the inscription inside. Always, Thomas. He held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, the history. Then he handed it back to Eleanor. "Put it somewhere safe," he said. "Not to forget him, but to honor what he gave you, including permission to love again. But Eleanor, from now on we move forward with complete honesty. No more secrets, no more orchestration, just two people choosing each other." Eleanor's face crumpled with relief. "No more secrets," she agreed. "Jonas, I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner." "You should have. But I understand why you didn't." He reached for her, pulled her into his arms. "We're both carrying ghosts, Eleanor. Your husband's, my unborn children's. The question is whether we're going to let those ghosts dictate our future, or whether we're going to honor them while building something new." Eleanor held him tight. "Something new. Please, let's build something new." They stood together in the cold January air, two people who'd been brought together by a mixture of intention and chance, grief and hope, broken dreams and new possibilities. The horses watched from their shelter, Sage at the front as always, wise eyes taking in the human drama. Later, Eleanor told him more, about finding the letter and weeping for hours, about the relief of knowing Thomas had wanted this for her, about her fear that Jonas would feel manipulated or used, about her genuine bone-deep love for the man who'd become far more than a description in a letter. And Jonas told her about his anger, his hurt, his fear that he'd been part of someone else's plan rather than part of a mutual choosing, but also about his understanding, his recognition that they'd both been trying to navigate impossible grief toward possible joy. "We're messy," Eleanor said that evening. "Both of us, carrying all our baggage and scars." "We're human," Jonas corrected. "And we're trying. That's enough." The wedding was still set for spring, but now it would be built on complete truth rather than partial disclosure. It would be harder, more vulnerable, scarier. It would also be real in a way nothing else had been. February brought a thaw, brief but welcome, and with it came decisions about the future. Jonas and Eleanor had weathered the revelation of Thomas's letter, had found their way through hurt and honesty to a stronger foundation. Now they faced practical questions about building a life together. "There's land adjacent to yours coming up for sale," Eleanor told him one afternoon. "The Patterson place. Old man Patterson died last fall, and his children back east want to sell. It's got better grazing land than what you have here, a natural spring, and a barn that's still in decent shape." Jonas had heard about the sale through town gossip, but hadn't given it much thought. Now he considered it with new interest. How much land? 40 acres, plus the structures. They're asking a fair price, more than I have saved, but with both our resources combined, we could manage it. Eleanor's expression was carefully neutral, letting him process without pressure. It would give us room to expand the horse operation, room to really build something. "You're talking about a business," Jonas said slowly. "Not just helping these 9 horses, but taking in others. There are so many animals that need help, Jonas. What we've learned with these 9, we could offer that to others. Build a reputation as a place where traumatized horses can heal." Eleanor's enthusiasm was evident now. It wouldn't make us rich, but it would be meaningful work. It would be legacy. That word again. Legacy. Jonas thought about his father's pocket watch, about the weight of expectations he'd carried for 15 years. Then he thought about Sage, about the way she now approached him with trust instead of fear, about Copper's playful affection, about Willow's gentle spirit emerging from beneath layers of trauma. "What about your teaching?" he asked. "I'd continue through the spring term, then transition out. Let them find a new teacher for fall. The town needs consistency, and I won't leave them scrambling." Eleanor paused. "But, Jonas, I've been teaching other people's children for years because I couldn't have my own. This would be different. This would be raising living creatures that need us, building something that lasts. It feels right." Jonas walked to the window, looked out at the 9 horses grazing peacefully. 6 months ago they'd been broken, terrified, seemingly beyond help. Now most of them were thriving, proof that healing was possible with patience and care. "Let's do it," he said, turning back to Eleanor. "Let's buy the land and build something together." The relief and joy on Eleanor's face made his decision feel right in a way words couldn't capture. They spent the evening planning, sketching rough layouts, discussing how to integrate the Patterson land with Jonas's existing property. For the first time since the doctor's diagnosis, Jonas felt genuine excitement about the future. They pooled their savings and made the purchase in early March. The Patterson children were happy to sell to someone local who'd care for the land. The transaction was simple, processed through the bank in Ridgeway, and suddenly Jonas and Eleanor owned 60 acres together, a partnership made official through shared property before the marriage itself had been formalized. "This is a big commitment," Martha said when she heard the news. She'd pulled Eleanor aside at the general store, her expression concerned but kind. "Buying land together before you're even wed. What if things don't work out?" "Then we'll have tried and failed together," Eleanor replied, echoing words she'd said to Jonas months before. "But Martha, I've never been more certain of anything. Jonas is a good man. This is the right path." Martha's face softened. "He is a good man. And you've been alone long enough, both of you. I'm happy for you, Eleanor. Truly." The town's blessing mattered more than Jonas had expected. When Pastor Reynolds offered to perform the ceremony at the church, with a proper reception to follow, Jonas accepted gratefully. They set the date for April 15th, giving them time to prepare but not so long that winter could trap them again. We should invite the whole town, Eleanor suggested. Make it a real celebration. These people have supported us both, accepted our unconventional courtship. We should share this joy with them. Jonas agreed, though the thought of being the center of attention made him uncomfortable. Still, if it made Eleanor happy, he'd endure anything. As the wedding approached, they turned their attention to the horses and the future of their operation. Word had spread about their success with the 9 rescued mares, and inquiries had begun to arrive. A rancher, 2 counties over, had a gelding traumatized by a mountain lion attack. A widow in town had an old mare she couldn't bear to put down but couldn't care for properly. Each request represented another creature in need, another opportunity to put their skills to use. "We can't take them all," Jonas cautioned. "Not until we've got proper facilities set up. Not until we've proven we can sustain this long term." "I know," Eleanor agreed. "But we can start planning. Map out where we'll build additional corrals, how we'll rotate grazing, what we'll need for medical supplies and feed storage. We can build toward being ready." They worked on those plans together in the evenings, Eleanor's organizational skills complementing Jonas's practical knowledge. She thought in systems and structures. He thought in immediate, hands-on needs. Together they created something more comprehensive than either could have managed alone. But alongside the excitement and planning, there remained one source of concern: Grace and Hope, the 2 horses who'd never fully recovered. Grace, the bay mare with the limp, had improved physically. The injury had healed as much as it would, and she could move without obvious pain. But emotionally, she remained distant, flinching at touch, barely tolerating human presence even after months of patient care. Hope, the small sorrel, was worse. She still huddled at the back of the herd, trembling at any approach, unable to accept kindness. "What if they never heal?" Eleanor asked one evening, watching Hope from a distance. "What if we've done everything we can and it's not enough?" Jonas put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Then we keep them safe and comfortable anyway. Healing isn't always complete recovery, Eleanor. Sometimes it's just learning to live with less fear, even if the fear never fully disappears." "Is that what you're doing?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Learning to live with less fear?" Jonas considered the question honestly. 6 months ago, he'd been drowning in grief and hopelessness, convinced his life was effectively over. Now he was planning a wedding, buying land, building a future that looked nothing like what he'd imagined, but felt right nonetheless. "I'm learning that the life I have can be enough," he said finally. "That different doesn't mean lesser. That what we're building together is valuable even if it's not what I originally planned." Eleanor turned in his arms, looked up at him with those perceptive eyes. "I'm still scared sometimes. Scared that I'm not enough for you, that you'll regret this choice." "I'm scared too," Jonas admitted. "Scared I'll fail you. Scared I'll wake up one day and realize I've been fooling myself about being happy. But I'm more scared of not trying, of letting fear keep me from the best thing that's ever happened to me." They held each other as the sun set, 2 people who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. The community rallied around the upcoming wedding in ways that touched Jonas deeply. Martha organized a group of women to sew Eleanor's dress, a simple but elegant design in cream-colored cotton. Frank Brennan, Martha's husband, donated lumber for building improvements on the new property. Several ranchers offered help with the barn, raising planned for late spring. "You're part of this community, whether you realized it or not," Martha told Jonas when he tried to protest the generosity. "You've been honest and fair in all your dealings for 15 years. That builds trust, builds respect. People want to help you succeed. Jonas found himself accepting the help with gratitude, recognizing that isolation wasn't strength, but fear in disguise. Letting people in, letting them help, was its own kind of courage. On a bright morning in early April, Jonas went to the barn where he'd hidden the cradle so many months ago. He pulled back the tarp, ran his hands over the unfinished cherry wood. It had been meant for a child he'd never have, a future that would never exist. Looking at it now didn't bring the sharp pain it once had, just a gentle melancholy for the path not taken. "What are you going to do with it?" Eleanor asked from the doorway. He hadn't heard her approach. Jonas turned, saw understanding in her expression. "I thought maybe we could finish it together. Not for a baby, but for something else. The first foal born on our property, maybe. A symbol of what we're creating instead of mourning what we can't have." Eleanor crossed to him, examined the cradle with careful attention. "It's beautiful work, Jonas. The carving is exquisite. Thomas would have loved the detail in these pine branches." "Let's finish it," Jonas said. "Together. Make it represent our future instead of my past." They worked on the cradle over the next week, sanding the rough edges, completing the carving, applying oil that brought out the rich grain of the cherry wood. It became a meditation, a way to transform something born of grief into something hopeful. When it was finished, they placed it in the barn, not as a hiding place, but as a promise of what might come. 10 days before the wedding, something remarkable happened. Jonas was working in the corral, replacing some worn fence posts, when he felt a gentle pressure on his shoulder. He turned slowly and found himself face to face with Hope. The small sorrel mare had approached on her own, had overcome her fear enough to touch him. Her eyes were still wary, still haunted by whatever she'd endured. But she was trying. She was choosing trust despite every instinct screaming danger. Jonas remained perfectly still, hardly breathing. Hope stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, her soft nose against his shoulder. Then she retreated, returning to the safety of the herd. But she'd done it. She'd made contact. Eleanor, who'd witnessed the moment from outside the corral, had tears streaming down her face. "She's healing," she whispered. "Even her, the one we thought might never recover." Jonas climbed out of the corral, pulled Eleanor into his arms. "We're all healing," he said. "Some faster than others, but all of us moving in the right direction." The wedding was 10 days away. The land was purchased. The plans were made. The community was rallying. And even the most broken among them, human and horse alike, were proving that healing was possible. Jonas thought about his father's pocket watch, about building a legacy. This wasn't the legacy his father had imagined. But it was real, it was good, and it was enough. Jonas kissed Eleanor with the church full of witnesses, and the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. It was the kind of kiss that sealed promises and opened futures, tender and passionate and full of hope. The reception was held on the new property, the Patterson land that was now theirs together. Tables had been set up under the trees, food brought by seemingly everyone in town. There was roasted venison and fresh bread, pies and cakes, preserves and pickles. Children ran wild in the spring sunshine, while adults talked and laughed and celebrated. Jonas found himself pulled into conversations he'd have avoided a year ago. Ranchers wanted to talk about the horse operation, asked questions about their methods, shared stories of animals they'd known. Women congratulated Eleanor, admired her dress, offered advice about marriage with knowing smiles. The community had fully embraced them, and Jonas realized he was no longer the isolated mountain man, but part of something larger. "Speech!" someone called out, and others took up the chant. "Speech!" Jonas felt panic rise, but Eleanor squeezed his hand reassuringly. Together they stood, facing their neighbors and friends. "I'm not much for speeches," Jonas began, and laughter rippled through the crowd. "But I want to thank you all for being here, for supporting us. A year ago, I was alone and convinced that's how I'd stay. Then this remarkable woman showed up with 9 traumatized horses and a refusal to take no for an answer." More laughter, warm and understanding. "She taught me that healing is possible, that broken things can be made whole, and that the life we get might be different from the one we planned, but no less valuable. So thank you, Eleanor, for choosing me, and thank you all for accepting us." Eleanor stood as Jonas sat down, her natural ease with public speaking evident. "Jonas is right. A year ago, neither of us imagined this day would come. I was still mourning my first husband, and Jonas was carrying his own grief. We found each other through horses that needed help, and in helping them, we helped each other heal. That's what community does. It gives us space to hurt and space to heal, and it celebrates with us when we find joy again. Thank you for giving us both." The celebration continued through the afternoon. Frank played his fiddle, and couples danced in the clearing. Children chased each other around the tables. The horses grazed peacefully in their corral, Sage watching the proceedings with her usual wisdom. As evening approached, Jonas and Eleanor slipped away from the crowd, walking to where the 9 horses stood. They'd been together through every step of this journey, silent witnesses to the transformation of 2 broken people into a united whole. "Look at them," Eleanor said softly. 6 months ago, they could barely stand to have us near. Now they're calm, healthy, content. Not all of them, Jonas pointed out. Grace and Hope still stood slightly apart from the herd, still carrying visible trauma despite months of care. "But even they're better than they were," Eleanor insisted. "Grace doesn't flinch as much. Hope approached you last week. Progress isn't always complete recovery. Sometimes it's just small steps in the right direction." Jonas pulled Eleanor close, rested his chin on top of her head. "Wise words from my wife." "Your wife," Eleanor repeated, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." They stood together as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Behind them, the sounds of celebration continued, laughter and music and the joy of community. Before them, the horses grazed in peace, evidence of what patience and love could accomplish. "I have something for you," Eleanor said, pulling back slightly. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in cloth. Jonas unwrapped it carefully and found a photograph in a simple wooden frame. It showed the 9 horses, all of them visible, standing in the corral with the mountains behind them. The image was remarkably clear, capturing each animal's unique personality, Sage's wisdom, Copper's playfulness, Willow's grace, even Grace and Hope's remaining wariness. "When did you have this taken?" Jonas asked, amazed. "Last week. I wanted to capture them as they are now, wanted us to remember this moment, where we started, what we've built together." Eleanor's eyes shone in the fading light. "This is our family, Jonas. Not the one we imagined, but the one we have. And it's beautiful." Jonas felt emotion swell in his chest. She was right. This was family, this woman beside him, these animals they'd saved together, this community that had embraced them, this land they'd committed to. It was different from what he'd dreamed, different from what his father had envisioned, but it was real and good, and enough. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too," Eleanor replied. "Now?" and always. They returned to the celebration hand in hand, husband and wife, ready to begin the life they'd built together from the wreckage of their separate griefs. The party continued late into the evening, but eventually the guests departed, leaving Jonas and Eleanor alone on their land. They walked to the barn where the completed cradle sat, beautiful in its polished simplicity. Eleanor ran her hand over the smooth wood. "Someday," she said, "a foal will be born here, and we'll use this." "Someday," Jonas agreed, "and it will be the beginning of something new." They stood together in the barn, surrounded by the tools of their trade and the evidence of their partnership, and felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd found their way home. 2 years later, autumn 1890, the operation had grown beyond anything Jonas and Eleanor had initially imagined. The barn they'd built together in the summer of '88 now housed 20 horses, each with its own story of trauma and recovery. Word had spread through the territory about the couple who could gentle even the most broken animals, and requests arrived regularly from ranchers, farmers, and families who couldn't bear to give up on horses others had declared hopeless. Jonas stood at the fence line, watching the herd graze in the golden October light. At 32, he looked different from the isolated man of 2 years ago. His face had filled out, the haunted look replaced by calm contentment. Eleanor's cooking and companionship had softened his edges, made him more approachable, more human. Sage grazed near the fence, her grey coat silvering with age. She was 17 now, the undisputed matriarch of the herd. 2 foals ran nearby, one hers, one Willow's, playing with the boundless energy of youth. Copper had grown into a magnificent stallion, his burnished coat gleaming in the sunlight. He'd sired several foals, his gentle temperament passing to the next generation. Even Grace and Hope, the 2 Jonas had feared might never fully recover, had found peace. Grace no longer limped, the injury long healed, and while she remained more reserved than the others, she approached humans without fear. Hope had blossomed in ways Jonas still found miraculous. She was gentle with the foals, patient with newcomers to the herd, and would eat from Eleanor's hand without hesitation. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Eleanor said, joining him at the fence. She carried a basket of apples, treats for the horses they'd hand-raised from traumatized to thriving. "Never gets old," Jonas replied, putting his arm around her waist. "Every time I think I'm used to seeing them like this, healthy and content, it hits me again how far they've come." Eleanor leaned into him comfortably. They developed a physical ease with each other, a partnership that showed in every gesture and glance. "A photographer is coming through town next week. I thought we might have him take a picture. You, me, and the herd. Document what we've built." Jonas considered this. 2 years ago, he'd have refused, uncomfortable with the attention. Now he recognized it for what it was, a way to mark this moment, to create evidence of the legacy they were building. "I'd like that," he said. They distributed apples to the horses, each animal approaching with trust and affection. These weren't just animals they cared for. They were family, each one known and valued. Jonas had learned all their personalities, their quirks, their preferences. He could read their moods, anticipate their needs, and provide exactly the kind of care each required. A wagon appeared on the trail, and Jonas recognized the driver, Tom Hendricks, a rancher from 3 counties over. The man had contacted them a month ago about a mare that had been caught in a barn fire. She'd survived but was now terrified of enclosed spaces, barely eating, wasting away despite his best efforts. "Mr. McCready, Mrs. McCready," Tom called, pulling the wagon to a stop. "I've brought Ember if you're still willing to take her." Jonas and Eleanor approached the wagon. Inside was a chestnut mare, thin and trembling, her coat dull despite obvious attempts at grooming. Burns scarred her flanks, and her eyes held the wild, desperate look Jonas had learned to recognize, the look of an animal convinced the world held only pain. "We're willing," Eleanor said gently. "Let's get her settled in the isolation corral. Give her space to adjust before introducing her to the herd." They spent the next hour getting Ember situated, moving slowly, speaking softly, giving her control over the pace of interaction. It was the same approach they'd used with the original 9, refined through 2 years of practice and dozens of traumatized animals. As Tom prepared to leave, he pulled Jonas aside. "I've heard what you charge is fair, but I want to pay extra. What you do here, it's more than business. You give these animals back their dignity. That's worth more than money." Jonas shook his head. "Fair price is fair price. We're not looking to get rich, just to do right by the animals and sustain the operation." After Tom left, Jonas returned to the isolation corral where Eleanor sat on a stump, watching Ember from a respectful distance. The mare was pressed against the far fence, every muscle tense, but she wasn't panicking. That was progress. "Think about the original 9, Eleanor said quietly. "How terrified they were, how impossible recovery seemed. Now look at them, thriving, raising foals, teaching the newcomers that humans can be trusted. We did that, Jonas. We created a space where healing is possible." Jonas sat beside her, took her hand. "We did. Together." They sat in comfortable silence, the way they often did, content to simply be present. Their marriage had deepened over 2 years, moved from the tentative early days through various challenges, disagreements about how to handle difficult horses, financial stress when feed prices spiked, the exhaustion of caring for so many animals, into something solid and enduring. Eleanor still taught, though she'd reduced her schedule to 3 days a week, spending the rest of her time with the horses and with Jonas. The children she taught knew about the operation, often visited to see the horses, learned from Eleanor and Jonas about patience and gentleness and the possibility of healing. "I was thinking about the cradle," Eleanor said. "Sage's foal from last spring, Legacy. He's growing so fast. Maybe it's time to pass the cradle on to someone who'll use it for its original purpose." Jonas considered this. The cradle had become a symbol for them, representing transformed dreams and new possibilities. But Eleanor was right. It had been made for children, and while they'd never have their own, they could gift it to someone who would. "Martha mentioned her daughter is expecting," Jonas said. "First grandchild. Maybe we could give it to them." Eleanor smiled. "Perfect. Thomas would have loved that. His saved money helping horses, the cradle you made going to a new baby. Everything coming full circle." The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Jonas thought about the journey that had brought him here, the devastating diagnosis, the isolation and despair, Eleanor's appearance with 9 impossible horses, and an even more impossible proposition. He thought about his father's pocket watch, about the legacy he'd been meant to build. This wasn't that legacy. This was something different, something he'd never planned or imagined. But it was real and good and meaningful. The horses they'd saved numbered in the dozens now. The techniques they'd developed were being shared with others, spreading hope beyond their own property. The community they'd built, Eleanor and Jonas, the human neighbors who supported them, the ever-growing herd, was something that would continue and grow. "I need to tell you something," Eleanor said, her tone suddenly serious. Jonas looked at her, concerned by the shift. "What is it?" "I'm happy," she said simply. "Completely, genuinely happy. I wanted you to know that, wanted to say it out loud, because there was a time I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again. Relief and love flooded through Jonas. I'm happy too. Happier than I ever thought possible. They stood, walked together toward the cabin as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Behind them, the horses settled in for the night. Sage watching over her family, the foals tucked against their mothers, even Ember standing slightly less rigid in her isolation corral. The photograph, when it was taken the following week, captured everything Jonas and Eleanor had built. They stood in front of the barn, surrounded by horses, the mountains rising behind them. Jonas wore his work clothes and his father's pocket watch. Eleanor stood beside him, her hand in his, her expression radiating contentment. The horses filled the frame. Sage and her foal, Copper and his offspring, all the original 9 and the dozen others they'd saved since. Years later, that photograph would hang in the main barn, a reminder of this moment when 2 broken people and their herd of broken horses had become something whole. Visitors would look at it and see success. But Jonas and Eleanor would see something else. They'd see the journey, the patience, the countless small choices to keep trying even when recovery seemed impossible. They'd see proof that dreams can take forms we never imagine, and that sometimes those unexpected forms are exactly what we needed all along. They'd see legacy not as blood and genes, but as impact and love and the space they'd created for healing. They'd see home. The mountains stood eternal, the horses grazed in peace, and 2 people who'd thought their stories were finished discovered that the best chapters were only just beginning. Life hadn't given them what they'd planned, but it had given them something better. Each other. This work, this community, this unexpected, beautiful life. And that, Jonas thought, as he held Eleanor close and watched their herd settle in for another peaceful night, was more than enough. It was everything